memory obviously is an incredibly relevant topic because one of the interesting things about psychology is we're actually not just learning content that doesn't have little relevance to our current lives or lives beyond school. But the amazing thing about psychology, one of the things that I actually loved about it so much, is it's actually relating to our lives here and now and our study. Like we can actually use what we're learning in psychology and apply it to our study habits, to actually how we're studying and learning information. So that's a really cool thing as well, especially when it comes to memory and learning, which is what we're covering today. So even as we're going, be thinking about one, how this relates to obviously the content you're covering in class, but also two, how you can be applying that to your own study habits, which is really cool. So memory, as you guys would probably know, there's multiple different types of memory that we actually look at in psychology. And one of the models of memory is the idea of sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, terms that I'm sure you guys have all heard before. So the thing is with a lot of concepts in psychology is they're actually very abstract. For example, intelligence. How do we actually measure that? Well, we have IQ, which is an intelligence quotient, which is a number you get from a test that is supposedly a predictor of your intelligence. And a lot of really smart people have done a lot of really accurate testing, and it does appear to be that your IQ actually is a measure, a predictor of your intelligence. But the interesting thing about psychology is because we're trying to quantify, we're trying to measure, we're trying to define very, very abstract concepts, we actually do often come up with a lot of models. Whereas in biology, for example, we know exactly how a hormone is released and the effect that it has on the body. Whereas memory is this really abstract concept where we're trying to break up what is memory, what is all of these different elements, durations, capacities. So that's why we actually do end up with so many different models, and which is actually why we look at so many of them in psychology. So we have a really rounded understanding of the major ways that different well-known psychologists view the idea of memory. So our first one, which is our sensory memory, our short-term memory, and our long-term memory, actually comes under the umbrella term of multistore model of memory. So if you're following on with class learning goals or the QCEE syllabus, I'm sure there'll be a learning goal about the multi-store model of memory. So we're going to have a bit of a look at that now. So first up is sensory memory, which is a store for incoming fleeting sensory information. So thinking about the world around us, there is constantly smells, there is sights, there is sounds that is all coming in all at once. And we would actually be incredibly overwhelmed if we were trying to perceive and make sense of all of that all at once. So our sensory memory is actually a really valuable tool, and that actually prevents us from being overwhelmed by everything that's coming in. And it actually, as information is coming in, it's actually sorting through what's coming in and deeming whether it's worthy to be brought into our short-term memory. As you can see, our arrows flowing through our diagram, which our short-term memory is our conscious memory, whereas our sensory memory we're actually not actively aware of. Information will only be moved from our sensory memory to our short-term memory if our brain is actively paying attention to it. So for example, sensory memory, my eyes can currently see all around here, but my focus is on my laptop and the notes that I have here because I'm focusing on this lecture. My brain would be quite overwhelmed if I was actively trying to process all the titles of my books and all the things up on my wall. And that actually would be very overwhelming for my brain, and I wouldn't be able to be effectively focusing on the lecture because the human brain is actually like we can actually only do one thing at once. We can't take in all the different things. So that's where our sensory memory is actually a really, really valuable tool to help us from not becoming overwhelmed. So the sensory memory actually has two parts, like you can see on the screen. We have our iconic, which is actually encodes visual information. So iconic is what we see, and it has a duration of 0.3 seconds, which is very, very, very short, but it has an unlimited capacity, which is just quite crazy to think about. So think about, for example, if you were at a New Year's party or something, and when people are drawing in the air with the sparklers, and it actually leaves, you can just see the trailing light. That's actually your iconic memory in action, because it's you're remembering just for that brief 0.3 seconds what it was that you saw there. And then our second form is our echoic memory, which also has an unlimited capacity, and it encodes acoustically. So the word encoding, if you haven't heard that before, refers to how the information is stored in our brain. So iconic memory is stored in that visual mode, whereas our echoic memory is our acoustic capacity for sensory memory. So think about, for example, echoic is actually our encoding for acoustic, like sound, like I said before. So some handy ways to remember that is maybe echoic acoustic, thinking about those initial sounds and how they relate. Or for me personally, the way that I remember it is echo. You think about how you hear an echo, and then you might think, for example, that you see an icon, which is a visual thing. So iconic is visual, and echoic, the echo, is our acoustic, our auditory encoding for sensory memory. So yeah, finding those little tricks to help you remember those things as well is really handy. Like we said with our sensory memory, it has an unlimited capacity, but only a very limited duration. So what we hear and see in our sensory memory fades very, very quickly unless we bring it into short-term memory. And our echoic memory, as you can see, is a little bit longer than our iconic memory. So our echoic memory is actually what allows us to retain the sounds of words long enough to comprehend full sentences. Because, for example, if I was going to say a sentence like, today we're learning about echoic memory, if our echoic memory faded really, really fast, we wouldn't even be able to remember the first half of the sentence, and that would actually interfere with our comprehension of what we're hearing. So that is a reason that our echoic memory does have that slightly longer capacity, which is really, really handy for our memory. So like I was saying before, if we pay attention to what we're kind of our brain's processing through our sensory memory, the information will actually come into our short-term memory, which is the store of information that is actively conscious. So if attention is paid to the information in sensory memory, it's transferred to our short-term memory, which is the equivalent of some other, I believe it's the working model of memory, refers to our working memory, which is what is actively conscious in my brain. That is kind of the equivalent of our short-term memory. So our short-term memory has a duration of up to 30 seconds. Some textbooks say 12 to 20, some say 12 to 30. So the rough guideline that I believe would get you the right marks on the exam would be that 12 to 20 up to 30 seconds kind of mark. So thinking about the capacity of our short-term memory, it has about 5 to 9 items. Past that, we start to get a bit mixed up. We start to forget things because while our sensory memory actually does have an unlimited capacity, our short-term memory, the things that we're consciously thinking about, it actually does have a very limited capacity. So for example, if I was writing a shopping list, it would actually be much more efficient to write a shopping list than try and remember the 10 things that I've got to grab from Coles or Woolies. So yeah, our short-term memory is a bit more limited than our two other memory stores, but it's also a really, really important part of the memory process. And then finally, we have our long-term memory, which if information comes into our sensory memory, if we pay attention to it, it enters our short-term memory. And then if we add meaning to it, if we encode it, if we actually file it away in our brains, the information actually enters long-term memory. And the amazing thing about long-term memory is the duration and capacity. So the duration being how long the memory can last, and the capacity being how many memories, how many items can we hold. It's actually virtually unlimited, which is just an incredible thing to think about, how the incredible capacity of the human brain. Like thinking back to, for example, if you're going for a walk and you smell a really nice smell, it might take you right back to a memory of early back in childhood that you hadn't even thought you remembered, which is kind of linking in the idea of how important cues can be in activating those long-term memories. So yes, info needs retrieval to bring it back from our long-term memory into our short-term memory. So that's our multi-store model of memory, which is one of the processes, one of the memory models that, we really do look at in psychology. So moving on, next we actually have types of long-term memory, we actually do have a few types of long-term memory that we're going to have a look at. So looking back here, we have our sensory memory, our short-term memory, and our long-term memory. And now we're going to have a look at our types of long-term memory. So at the top of our diagram, you'll see that we have long-term memory. The two sub-branches from there is explicit long-term memory and implicit long-term memory. So our explicit memory is memories of facts, names, images, and events. It can actually also be called declarative memories as well. The two terms can be used slightly interchangeably. So it's the conscious retrieval, memory and recall, recognition, and it's the responsibility of the hippocampus. So explicit memory, think explicit, think facts, names, images, and events. So explicit is very factual, the things that you know. So for example, if on an exam you were asked, what are the types of long-term memory? If you could say it is explicit and implicit, that would actually be an example of using your explicit memory, such as would be like naming the countries of the world, and all of those, facts and images, names, events, all of those are our explicit memory. Whereas our implicit memory is actually more of our subconscious memory, whereas explicit must be actively used. Like, I'm trying to recall this factual information that I've learned. So it's that explicit memory is what we're actively using. Whereas our implicit is more of that subconscious memory of skills, emotions, preferences, and dispositions. It's actually a part of our memory, but it's actually, we don't need to actively recall it. So for example, if I heard a really loud noise, I wouldn't like that loud noise, although that's not quite as related to memory. But for me, for example, one time when I was quite a bit younger, I went on a camping trip and I actually had a really bad pie from a cafe that I went to. I won't name and shame the cafe, but I actually had a really bad pie from this cafe, and I'm sorry if you're squeamish, but I actually did end up with food poisoning, and I was actually quite unwell after eating that pie. So whenever I hear the name of that cafe now, I'm like, oh, and I get quite like that unpleasant feeling, which is my implicit memory, because that's remembering a disposition, a preference that I have. And so I didn't have to actively think about, oh, so what is it that I think about this cafe? It's just an implicit, unconscious memory that comes back to you. Or for example, another common example is riding a bike. You don't have to actively think about, okay, I've got to balance my hands on the bars, I've got to pedal with my left leg, right leg, left leg, right leg. It's just a very implicit skill that just comes straight back to us. So yeah, that's our two contrasting types of explicit memory. Our more conscious, factual memory is explicit, and then our implicit is more of our things that come naturally, skills, dispositions, preferences, and that one's actually processed in the amygdala and possibly the cerebellum as well. Or for example, if you're very musical, that could even be an example of implicit memory, because it just comes very naturally. Whereas at the moment I'm learning the ukulele, which is actually quite exciting, but for me at the moment, I'm still not very fluent in my skills. So at the moment it's very explicit. I have to think, okay, which chord is my C? Which type of strumming am I needing to use? Whereas somebody that's quite fluent in playing the guitar is just going to be implicitly recalling those skills and just playing very naturally. So that's just another example to contrast those two types. So another example, another subcategory that we can see on our little flowchart that we have here is procedural memory, which is implicit. So procedural memory is one aspect of implicit memory, and it's memory for how to perform tasks, skills, actions, and conditioned responses. So procedural memory is literally implicit memory to do procedures. So whether that be subconsciously, I'm remembering how to stir my cake mixture, or I'm just remembering how to ride my bike. That's again our implicit procedural memory, and we only do have the one type there as well. Moving back to the other side of our map, we have our explicit memory, which can be broken down into episodic and semantic. So remembering that our explicit memory is our facts, names, images, events. It can be broken down into our episodic, which is memories or events or experiences in your life. So for me, thinking back to when I was in year 12. That's an example of retrospective episodic memory, because retrospective, think retro, think old, so think in the past. So retrospective episodic memory is thinking back to events in your personal past. And prospective, think of like prospects, the future, is actually remembering things to do in the future. So I might be thinking, oh, I have an assignment to write for uni next week. That's explicit because I'm actively thinking about it. And then it comes across to episodic because it's a memory, event, or experience. It's a part of my life. And then that's actually prospective because I'm thinking back to the future. Whereas if I was thinking back to something that happened last week, we're coming back to retrospective again because we're thinking back to the past. Finally, coming back down to our last one, long-term memory, explicit, conscious thinking about it, but semantic memory is actually memory for facts, worldly knowledge, or general knowledge. So the example I gave before earlier about knowing geography would come under our semantic memory, whereas thinking about events from and facts from your personal life, such as maybe your sister's birthday even, would come under the episodic memory, because there's those two differences.